The title of chapter 20 is Girding for War, the North and South. So finally, we've gotten here. It's about time, right? We've been talking about it quite a bit, about the Civil War and the things that helped bring on the Civil War. And here we are. It's here, Civil War. Finally, you've got all the different things that have occurred all the way back. I mean, it goes way back since the beginning of slavery, but North versus South. So the strange thing about this war is that the election happened in November of 64 and November of 59 and or 60. Sorry, I got my dates mixed up here. November of 60, Abraham Lincoln is elected president. He's president elect until April of or May of 1861. So, and one by one, the states started seceding from the Union even before Abraham Lincoln became president. So he was just president-elect at the time. He was frustrated because there's nothing he could do. Also frustrated in that Buchanan, the sitting president, felt it wasn't his place to do anything and just wanted to ride out the last months of his presidency. So, and then, the war really starts in South Carolina at a place called Fort Sumter. Thing is, Fort Sumter was a federal arsenal. It was owned by the United States government. And, obviously it's in the heart of rebel territory, South Carolina. South Carolina is the leader of this whole rebellion. They're the first state to secede from the Union. It seems like they have always been the most rambunctious of the states. It goes all the way back to John C. Calhoun and, the pissing match that we talked about between Jackson and Calhoun. I mean, it's in their blood at this point. So, a federal arsenal located in the heart of Dixie, so to speak, in the South, probably wasn't going to be able to survive. But Abraham Lincoln was going to take this as an opportunity to start the war under his terms. Very important that you understand. He wanted to start the war under his terms. If the war could have been prevented, then he would have liked that, obviously. But he knew that it was coming, and there was really nothing anybody could do about it. He just wanted to make sure that the war started the way he wanted it to start. There were 100 men guarding Fort Sumter, and they were surrounded by the rebel forces, and they didn't know what to do. So just jumping ahead here, here's a picture of the island of Fort Sumter, where Fort Sumter is located, and here's a map so you see it. Fort Sumter is located right here. So there were rebel forces all around Fort Sumter in the mainland, and Fort Sumter sits out here like a sitting duck, really, just all guns and batteries pointed at the fort. And the troops that were there didn't quite know what they should do. So they wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln saying, what would you like us to do? Do you want us to fight to the death? Do you want us to surrender the fort? Give us instructions. And they said, in the meantime, we are going to need supplies because we're running out of supplies. Obviously, with 100 men on that small island, supplies became really important. It's not like they could just take a boat, go over to Charleston and go, get supplies from there. There's no way they were going to be able to do that. So Abraham Lincoln answered that and said, we will provision you. They said, we will send a ship there. And he also let the Confederacy know that an unarmed ship would be arriving at Fort Sumter to provision the fort, not weapons, just food and clothing, whatever they needed. He let the Confederacy know that and then he told those 100 men in that letter, do not, under any circumstances, fire the first shot. And here's part of Lincoln's strategy you could see here, is that he didn't want the North, the Union, to be the aggressor. He wanted to be able to always say that the South started the war. It was very important to him, as I'll explain as we go on here. So the ship the provisional ship, the ship that was loaded with provisions, was arriving at Fort Sumter. And as it got close to Fort Sumter, the Confederacy fired on it, and the ship had to turn away without provisioning the fort. Once that happened, it was on. They started firing at Fort Sumter. The men at Fort Sumter then were it was okay for them to fire back. And that's how the Civil War started. And it's exactly the way Abraham Lincoln wanted it to start. Right? They fired the first shot, the rebels did. He didn't want that to happen. So you could see after the battle, you could see the bombardment that occurred. Very little. It's not a massive battle where there are a lot of deaths, only a few, very minimal damage. But at the end of the day, the Confederacy win that battle. The 100 American troops surrendered. They waved the white flag, and they were allowed to retreat and leave. So a ship came, picked them all up, and they all went their separate ways. And that's how the Civil War started. Now, there was an eerie calm after this before the next battle that occurs that we'll be talking about in the next chapter, which is at Battle of Bull Run. But this is how things got underway. Now they knew there was going to be a fight, that the South was not going to leave peacefully. The North wasn't going to let them leave, and they weren't going to do it peacefully. Okay, so let's talk about why Abraham Lincoln wanted the war to start under his terms. And it has everything to do with the green states in this map right here: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. These 4 states are considered to be border states. Now, the definition of a border state during the Civil War is two things. One would be they are on the border between the North and the South. They are definitely on the border. More importantly, they are slave states, but they remained in the Union. The gray states below are slave states that left the Union. The blue states above are free states, and they make up the Union. The 4 border states also make up the Union, but they just so happen to be slave states. Now, one thing in common with Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware is there weren't that many slaves, especially Delaware. There was a large populations in all 4 states that really were against separation. They didn't like secession. And so therefore, there wasn't enough support in those states to secede from the Union. However, Abraham Lincoln was obsessed with making sure that those 4 border states remained in the Union. Right? States like Missouri and Kentucky would provide cattle, which is beef, to feed the rebel troops if they left. Maryland and Delaware had a lot of industry, factories, and he didn't want those states to go down to the Confederacy. And then when you look at it, when you really look at it, you've got a legitimacy issue also. So the Union could always say, well, there's 20 states that remained in the Union and 11 states that left. Now, if you take those 4 states and all 4 states jump down to the Confederacy, now you've got a more legitimate country in the Confederacy, in that it would be 16-15. Not that that's the end all be all, but again, in Abraham Lincoln's mind, he was obsessed with making sure that those 4 border states remained in the Union, right, for many, many reasons. And so everything that comes out of his mouth is calculated at this point, very calculated to make sure that these states stay. Okay, so just examples of, some things that Abraham Lincoln did. And the other thing I'll mention too is back to this map, Maryland's close proximity to Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is located between Virginia and Maryland, right? It's right there. I mean, there's times when you're in D.C., when 1 minute you're in D.C., the next minute you're in Maryland, and then you walk a few steps and you're in Virginia. So it's right smack dab in the middle. Virginia is already out, right? Virginia has left the Union. So you could see they're gray right here. If Virginia and Maryland leave, if Maryland leaves also, then you've got in the middle, you've got DC. So it might be something like, where Fort Sumter is over here, where you're, a federal entity that is surrounded by rebel land. You know, they didn't want this to be another Fort Sumter type situation. So to lose the capital meant probably losing the war. So that was an obsession of Abraham Lincoln, is to make sure that, you know, Maryland stayed in the Union, and he was going to use whatever he needed to use. Sometimes it was, you know, being nice and you know, humanitarianism, but then sometimes it was martial law. So Lincoln's quest for the border states, examples of them, he called the war a war to save the Union and not free the slaves. Right, calling the war to save the Union and not free the slaves, where he actually made that statement. The reason he does that, doing it that way, means that the border states would not, he thought that the border states would not think that it would be a war to free the slaves and they may stay in. It's just to save the Union. If you were to come out and say it's to free the slaves, then he felt like the 4 border states would jump down the Confederacy and he'd lose them. He declared martial law in the border states, especially he really, really was strict on this in Maryland. Martial law, right? They had curfews and the you get the military would go around arresting people who were trying to drum up support for secession, and then they'd put them in jail. Now, under normal circumstances, the judge has the right to throw out a case if there is not enough evidence. And for sure, you know, a Maryland judge would say there's not enough evidence to hold these prisoners who have been arrested because they might create rebellion and secession. And you know, there was no hardcore evidence. So most of these judges would throw it out and they would go free. But Abraham Lincoln suspended the judge's writ of habeas corpus. The writ of habeas corpus is the right that judge has to throw out a case, and he couldn't do that anymore. So through martial law, they arrested people who were rebel rousers, they were called, and then they stayed in jail until the war was over because the writ of habeas corpus was taken away from judges. And then at times he had supervised voting in the border states, not very democratic, but he's sacrificing democracy to save the Union in his eyes. People's civil liberties were definitely taken away here, but Abraham Lincoln justifies it by saying, if I don't suspend people's liberties, then the Constitution may be gone, done forever. So it's a temporary thing. He lets everybody know. Also, lastly here, African Americans were denied the right to fight for the Union. Abraham Lincoln would not allow African Americans to fight. The South was recruiting African Americans to fight, telling them that they would get their freedom and independence if they fought for the Confederacy, whereas Lincoln said no. Once again, goes back to the border states. If the border states saw African Americans fighting for the Union, they'll think it was a war to end slavery, and they'll jump down to the Confederacy. So as you can see, Abraham Lincoln was obsessed with the border states. So going into this thing, there's some definite advantages that the North has over the South. South has some important advantages also. The miraculous thing is that the South is able to hold out for 4.5 years in this war. It's a 4.5-year war. When you look at all the Northern advantages, more population, meaning more men to fight, more railroads for transportation of troops, as well as supplies to the battle lines, right? They had way more railroads in the North than they did that in the South. They had more money in the North because that's where all the banking is and that's where all the business is. There were immigrants in the North. Immigrants didn't go down to the South because they had to compete with slave labor. So what could immigrants do? They could work in factories making guns. They could work. They could they were allowed in the military, and they would fight for the Union cause. So more industrial capacity, meaning more industry, more factories, produce more guns, more things that they need, supplies. Better technology, meaning that weapons would be better. And of course, more food. All the food is grown in the North. The South grows cotton, and you can't eat cotton. So, they were starving to death in the South. Tons of advantages for the North. You would think it would be an easy victory, but it's not. The Southern advantages were better generals, because anybody who was a leader in the South would go into the military. If you're a leader in the North, you're going into business and you're making money. So the best and the brightest in the South went into the military and became generals. Case in point, Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, well-known Southern military personnel that's just way better than the North had. The fact that they need only hold off the North, they don't have to really win any battles. They will win battles, but all they are after is making sure that the North gets tired of fighting and quits, and then they've won. And then they have home field advantage, right? They're going to be fighting on their turf. They never have to go up into the North to fight if they don't want to. Now, they do on a couple different occasions that we'll talk about in the next chapter, but they didn't have to if they didn't want to. But the thing that helped them most and kept them in the war for 4.5 years was better strategy, because they had better generals. Okay, no doubt about it. In the South, you knew that cotton was the lifeblood of the South. It was everything to them. And the South fully expected France and Great Britain to come to their aid and help them in this Civil War, because they relied on the South. They relied on the South for that cotton, so they could produce clothes, so they could send it out to the rest of the world. That's how they made their money in France and England in the factories. They had tremendous factories, way better than in the United States. So yeah, and then if they don't get their cotton, the Confederacy said, "Oh, they'll come and help us in this war," which they never do that. It's a big blow to the South. If they would have gotten British support or French support, they might have been able to win the war. There were a couple times when it was really dangerously close to happening. Uncle Tom's Cabin plays a big role in this also. Once again, another big reason why Uncle Tom's Cabin is such a hugely important book in world history is that people in France and Great Britain were reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, and the citizens of those countries didn't want their leaders to go to war against a country or with a country that's fighting to keep slaves. So Uncle Tom's Cabin helped win this war also. I think I mentioned that before. In the end, Europe received cotton from Egypt as well as from the North. How about this? The North would go down into the South, steal cotton, put it on boats, send it to England to tide them over so they wouldn't get too desperate for cotton. So they would do that quite often. And in the end, it worked. Last slide here for part one was the Trent Affair. I told you that it was dangerously close to having Great Britain come into the war on the side of the Confederacy. And here's an example. Great Britain sends a ship over. They would not send a ship over to any southern ports because it was too dangerous, and they didn't want it to appear like they're siding with the Confederacy. So they made an arrangement with the Confederacy. They still wanted to recognize them. In the event that the South wins the war, Britain wanted to set up a working relationship with them so they could continue to get their cotton. So they wanted to keep the communication lines open. They weren't going to fully side with them and help them in battle, but they wanted diplomacy. They wanted to talk. So they sent a ship to Havana, Cuba, and they told the Confederate leaders to meet them there. They'd pick them up. They'd take them to Great Britain. They'd meet with the British government, and they'd work out some kind of working agreement in the event that they win the war. Well, that ship gets stopped by an American ship. The Trent stops it. The Americans board the ship. They find the British officials. They arrest them. They arrest the Confederates, not the British. They arrested the Confederates that were on board the British ship. They put them in jail, and Great Britain was furious. They said it was a violation of freedom of the seas. The Americans had no business stopping a British ship. The Trent, the British ship was the Trent. They had no business stopping that ship, and they threatened war. And they even went so far as to get 8,000 troops and send them to the Canadian border ready to attack the United States from the north, from Canada, because the British owned Canada, as you know. And it would have been a two-front war for the Americans, and Abraham Lincoln knew that that would be the worst thing that could possibly happen. So he apologized. He released the Confederates and said it will never happen again. And the whole situation dissipated. Everybody, calmer heads prevailed. And that was the last time that we were close to war with Great Britain during the Civil War. Could have happened. And that's the end of part one.